I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. Welcome in, folks, to the Week 11 Start Sit Show. And I've got 5 Underdog fantasy picks for you at the end of the show. But first, just a quick little intro. Because I moved to Dallas about 6 months ago, this is going to be a callback bid for everyone that enjoyed the Podfather's fascination with the Dallas Cowboys. Do we remember and rightfully so, do we all remember a few years ago when the Dallas Cowboys were playing fast and they were exciting and Tony Pollard was kind of bursting onto the scene? Well, I have finally mastered the Podfather's signature catchphrase. Right as they lose Dak Prescott, the city is in shambles over this team. But how about them Cowboys? I've been perfecting that in my apartment. It drives my girlfriend nuts. We were the grocery store we go to has like you park and then there's an elevator to go up to the grocery level. And we were just crammed in like sardines the other day on a Sunday morning. 3-4 Cowboys jerseys in the elevator. And I gave her the look and she basically was mouthing to me, "Don't fucking do it." So you know what? I chose my relationship. But I was so close to giving a nice little, "How about them Cowboys?" right before they got trounced by the Eagles. All right, folks, let's get into it. Starts and sits at quarterback. We are going to be starting Russell Wilson this week, the Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 11 versus the Baltimore Ravens. When we look at matchups, the Ravens are the second best matchup for opposing quarterbacks. Because what I do is I adjust for opponents faced. After adjusting for opponents faced, quarterbacks are scoring 4.5 points above their season-long average when they face the Baltimore Ravens. 4.5 fantasy points above their average. We like that. Let's take a trip down memory lane, shall we? The past 5 games, they allowed 35 fantasy points to Joe Burrow, 21 fantasy points to Jaden Daniels, 27 fantasy points to Baker Mayfield, 26 fantasy points to Jameis Winston, 19 fantasy points to Bo Nix, and 34 fantasy points again to Joe Burrow. The Ravens offense scores points, but their defense simply cannot stop opponents through the air. Russell Wilson, to his own credit, has topped 19 fantasy points 2 of his 3 starts for the Steelers. I think he makes it 3 of 4 starts with above 19 fantasy points this week. And stream Drake Maye, the Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 16 this week versus the Rams. Now, I get it. Drake Maye, he struggled last week against the Bears. That's a bottom 5 matchup for quarterbacks. But before that, he had 18 fantasy points, 21 fantasy points, 21 fantasy points in his 3 full starts. I'm removing the game where he had 11 fantasy points in like the first quarter before he got concussed after 6 pass attempts against the Jets. 11 fantasy points in pretty much a quarter against the Jets. This guy's good. Drake Maye looks like he might end up being the best rookie quarterback from the 2024 class. This week, the Rams are a slightly above average matchup for quarterbacks, and I'm just going to ride the Drake Maye wave at this point. I'm firing him up in a high-stakes league where I'm not really happy with the current options. I did a little bit of Baker Mayfield at points this year and think, you know what? He's on bye. It's Drake Maye time, and I'm not even concerned about that. Running back. Start David Montgomery, the consensus running back 16 versus the Jaguars. Jaguars, second best matchup for running backs to begin with. Running back rooms are averaging over 5 fantasy points above their average. Against the Jags, we like that. Here's the thing. So the Lions, I had to blink twice. The Lions are ridiculous 14-point favorites over the Jaguars in the betting markets. I don't think people realize out there who don't bet how rare that is to see a team as a 2-touchdown favorite. The Lions' 30-point implied team total, 30 points of offense implied in the betting market. That is by far the highest of week 11. If there was ever a grinded out David Montgomery game, give him 20 carries, let him score 2 touchdowns. This is it. And one question I've gotten a couple times before we get to our next running back start is, Josh, why don't you, they're out there in the Twitter streets or other social medias and they see these people with they fire up these graphics and they're like, my priority start of the week is Saquon Barkley. Consensus has him quarterback 5. I think or running back 5. I think he's running back 3. Is that helpful? No, No one out there was like, oh, like, I wasn't sure to start him. So I'm always going to try to give you players where, like David Montgomery, what were you taking him in the 6th, 7th round? Like there's a chance that when you drafted David Montgomery in fantasy football, that he's not your every week starter. That's really what I'm trying to get, is sitting players that you might actually be starting and starting players that you might actually consider sitting. I'm not here to give you the obvious layups. I don't want to artificially improve my hit rate just by saying, oh, the running back 6 this week, start him. The wide receiver 5 this week, start him. The quarterback 26 this week, yeah, folks, he's going to be a sit. We're trying to dig a little bit deeper than that. Got one more running back start for you, and then I've got a desperation running back start because some people are desperate in week 11. Start Nick Chubb, Fantasy Pros consensus running back 22 at the Saints. Saints are the 5th best matchup. Running backs have 3.5 more fantasy points above expectation against the Saints. 5th best when you adjust for opponents faced. We like that. Browns, they're quietly 1-point favorites coming off of their week 10 bye. I think they're going to be able to run a lot against the Saints. And the Saints themselves are just allowing 113 rushing yards per game at 5.2 yards per carry. We love that. Nick Chubb off the bye week. Expect him to get a heavy workload. And I think he's going to look even healthier. Desperation start. Jaylen Warren. Fantasy Pros consensus running back 31 versus the Ravens. Now, the Ravens have shut down running backs on the ground this year. The aforementioned, big word. You're welcome, folks. The aforementioned Nick Chubb. His 52 rushing yards in week 8 against the Ravens. That's the most any running back has had against the Ravens this year. But the Ravens have allowed the 6th most receptions to running backs, and then the 3rd most running back receiving yards this year. The Steelers had the week 9 bye. They came off the bye, and in week 10, Jaylen Warren ran 50% more routes than Najee Harris, and overall, Najee Harris only outtouched Jaylen Warren 21-16. Pretty close split. I think Warren can be a fantasy running back too in a pinch for week 11 if you absolutely need it. Now, we've got a couple questions in the chat, then we'll hit the receivers. All right, folks. Bradley has a log jam at wide receiver in half PPR. CeeDee Lamb, Jaden Reed, Jawan Jennings, Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins, Cedric Tillman can only start 3. Thanks. All right, I am going Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins, and then probably Jaden Reed. But we'll get to that. Yeah, I think that's probably how I'm going to have it. Someone asking if they should sit London for Nick Chubb. I think I'd still play Drake London, but I do think Nick Chubb's going to have a higher floor. So there we go. Yeah, someone in the chat just said, think Eckler and Brian Robinson last night for for Steelers running back usage, where Eckler had massive running back usage against the Eagles. I think that could very well be the case. Yes, I think that's a great parallel chat. Thank you. Now let's get to those wide receiver starts, because I think it's going to help some people out. Start Courtland Sutton. Consensus wide receiver 19 versus the Falcons. Falcons is just a very good matchup for outside receivers this year. Sutton has caught fire recently as well. The past 3 weeks, he's averaged 10 targets, 7 catches, 97 receiving yards, 18 fantasy points per game. He even had 6 catches, 70 yards, and a touchdown against the Chiefs last week, the toughest possible matchup. I was wrong. I thought he would be a sit last week. I was wrong. He did what pretty much no other receiver has been able to do against the Chiefs. Courtland Sutton, Bo Nix, that is a budding NFL connection. We like that. Start Calvin Ridley, consensus wide receiver 20 versus the Vikings. The Vikings are an above average matchup for receivers on the outside. DeAndre Hopkins is no longer there. The past 3 weeks, Ridley's averaged 11 targets, 7 catches, 100 receiving yards, 21 fantasy points per game. The Vikings can stop the run, but they're 6-point favorites. I think the Titans are going to be passing a lot. It's a good game script for a lot more Calvin Ridley targets. And we're going to start Khalil Shakir, consensus wide receiver 27 versus the Chiefs. The Chiefs are the worst matchup for running backs and outside receivers in all of fantasy, but they do struggle against the slot. When you adjust for slot receivers faced, they are the 6th best matchup for the slot. And I put on my binoculars. I scouted And I saw that Khalil Shakir's receiving yards prop is actually 5 yards higher than DeAndre Hopkins in that matchup, Bills-Chiefs. There's heavy juice on Khalil Shakir's receiving yards over at 57.5 yards. That's a lot of yards for a receiving prop. I was impressed. I don't think it makes sense why DeAndre Hopkins is ranked wide receiver 21, yet Khalil Shakir is the consensus wide receiver 27, when DeAndre Hopkins' receiving yardage total is lower, and his touchdown odds, the odds that he scores a touchdown, are also lower than Shakir. And I'm not even here to say that DeAndre Hopkins at wide receiver 21 is wrong. I'm just here to say Khalil Shakir should be next to him, if not even the spot ahead of him. So we're going to start him this week. It's a player I've often been negative on and wrong on this year, Khalil Shakir. I've come around. It's a good matchup. Start Jacoby Meyers. He's in here every week because consensus hates Raiders players. They should not hate Jacoby Meyers. Consensus wide receiver 28 this week at the Dolphins. Dolphins are an average matchup for outside receivers like Jacoby Meyers. But the past 5 games without Davante Adams, Meyers has gone superhuman. He's getting 9 targets, 6.5 receptions, 68 yards, 16 fantasy points per game. Jacoby Meyers is basically a low-end fantasy wide receiver 1 without Davante Adams right now. The Raiders are touchdown underdogs. They're going to throw to Jacoby Meyers. Tight end. Start Jonnu Smith. Consensus tight end 14 versus the Raiders. Raiders are the 6th best matchup for tight ends. I'm going to take the official L on Jaylen Waddle. We're taking some dubs this week. We're taking some L's this week. We take them both right on the chin. And Jaylen Waddle has sucked. Jonnu Smith has 2 more receptions than Jaylen Waddle this year. He only has 20 fewer yards than Jaylen Waddle. I still don't know what's going on. Jaylen Waddle looks like he's getting open. I know he's fast. I know he's good at football. I don't quite know what's going on. Same thing with Tyreek Hill. Like, Tyreek Hill is the wrist injury. I'm like, what's going on with Jaylen Waddle? This Dolphins offense has been so frustrating, except for Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith has at least 45 yards for the past 5 weeks. He's just got a good role in a consolidated pass offense. It's a great matchup. We're going to start him. And then people out there, they wanted the dart throw at tight end. Here you go. Dawson Knox. Dalton Kincaid, I'm recording this Friday morning. Dalton Kincaid did not practice on Wednesday or Thursday due to his knee injury from last week. We wanted to start Kincaid last week. Some people were angry at me for saying start him. Dalton Kincaid had basically 5 targets in like a quarter of football last week. He was on pace for like 15 to 20 targets. I don't know what to tell you. He got injured. It was a great matchup. Dalton Kincaid, pour one out. The guy got injured in his best matchup of the year. Brutal. Dawson Knox is the consensus tight end 20 versus the Chiefs. Chiefs are the 4th best matchup for tight ends. Keon Coleman's already been ruled out. I think Knox might be the 3rd option in the passing game after Amari Cooper and Khalil Shakir in a potential shootout. Now, folks, we're going to hit you with those fantasy sits. I've got 5 underdog fantasy picks for you coming up right after the break.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like, we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than, you 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins-Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson had 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back, folks. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator Fantasy Starts and Sits. We've got a question in the chat while we had our little underdog ad running. Would you go Jonnu Smith over Hunter Henry to fill in for Trey McBride's bye week? I would still go Hunter Henry slightly. Probably. Yes. I think I'd lean Hunter Henry, but I don't have a strong preference. That's a great question. I don't have a take. We'll end it there. All right, sits, quarterback. You're so excited. You got him off the week 10 bye. I think, though, that you should sit Jordan Love, Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 12 at the Bears. So the Bears are the fourth worst matchup for opposing quarterbacks in fantasy. Fantasy quarterbacks average 3.5 points below their season average against the Bears. Jaden Daniels had 22 fantasy points against the Bears. Round of applause. Trevor Lawrence had 18 fantasy points against the Bears. Round of applause. No other quarterback reached 15 fantasy points in the other 7 games against the Bears this year. The Bears are a top 10 matchup for running backs. I think it's a Josh Jacobs game. It's an uphill battle for Jordan Love. I think what's tough is that the Bears offense is not playing well, and the Bears defense is playing really well. That makes for the worst conditions for your opposing quarterback, like a Jordan Love. Running back, sit. All right, we won't fully sit him if you don't have to, but I told everyone last night on Twitter at Larky tweets, temper expectations with Terry McLaurin. I took him out of a couple lineups myself. Terrible matchup. Terry McLaurin, 1 catch, 10 yards. I don't think it's going to be that bad, but I am starting to get a little nervous for James Cook. Consensus running back 18 versus the Chiefs. Chiefs are by far the worst matchup for fantasy running backs. The Chiefs have faced Bijan Robinson, Alvin Kamara, Derrick Henry. That's 3 of the top 5 running backs in fantasy points per game. None of those guys reached 14 fantasy points against the Chiefs. In fact, no running back has reached 14 fantasy points against the Chiefs this year. You might need to start James Cook due to week 11 buys, but temper expectations. Also at running back, sit Tony Pollard. Consensus running back 23 versus the Vikings. Vikings are the 3rd worst matchup for opposing running backs. Tajay Spears returns to the lineup last week. Tony Pollard, 9 carries. Tajay Spears, 7. 9-7. Routes run, Pollard, 14. Spears, 12. That is 9-7, 14-12. Those are nearly 50-50 timeshare splits. We do not like that. The Titans' implied team total this week is only 17 points in the betting markets. 17 points of offense. That's not a lot of touchdown upside. It's the 2nd lowest for any team for week 11. You drafted Tony Pollard in round 7, round 8. Good chance you've got 2 better options to fire up for week 11. At receiver, sit CeeDee Lamb. Consensus wide receiver 17 versus the Texans. How about them Cowboys? You thought I wasn't going to get another one in, folks? Come on. This whole Cowboys offense is a disaster with Cooper Rush or Trey Lance taking snaps at quarterback. The team's got no run game. There's no other receiving options to protect Lamb. I'm simply benching Dallas players right now. I don't really see the upside for any of them or how they're going to burn you if you sit them and leave them on your bench. The Cowboys are tied for the 2nd lowest implied team total of 17 offensive points with the Titans. Lamb's touchdown odds are plus 200 in the betting markets. That's basically a 33% chance that CeeDee Lamb scores. Terrible. For context, producers, if you're listening, this could be a good one to cut up. Pat Freiermuth has significantly better touchdown odds this week than CeeDee Lamb. Oof. One more wide receiver sit for you. Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Fantasy Pros consensus wide receiver 31 at the Niners. Now, the past 2 games, Smith-Njigba's had 6 catches for 69 yards. Nice. And 7 catches for 180 yards and 2 touchdowns. But that was without DK Metcalf, who returns this week. His other 7 games, he topped 53 yards once. The Niners are a bad matchup for slot receivers. Jaxon Smith-Njigba's averaging under 11 fantasy points per game in the 7 games without DK Metcalf, which would be outside the top 40 at the position. It's a tough matchup. I'm simply not that interested. And then Taysom Hill, Fantasy Pros consensus, tight end 8 versus the Browns. Sit. I'm not sure what we're doing here at this point. I advocated to start him last week. The role was supposed to increase last week with no Chris Olave. 2 targets. 4 carries. You're hoping for a touchdown. I get it. But the role itself is not there. When we look at goal to go carries near the goal line last week, all of them went to Kamara. None of them went to Taysom Hill. I think Taysom Hill is like tight end 16-ish. Fantasy tight end 2 type. He's not a must start tight end 8. Now, before we get to those 5 Underdog fantasy picks, we got a couple more questions in the chat. Thinking of starting Dowdle over Pollard. Should I be worried about the matchup? I'm looking at the timestamp. Did you ask this while I was discussing why I don't like Pollard? I don't like Dowdle either. You have two terrible options, but I think Dowdle, it's been announced that he's going to get all the touches going forward for the Cowboys. I think I'd start him over Pollard, who's in a timeshare, but it's gross. And just like that, I'm benching Dowdle. No. I think I'd go with Dowdle. Two terrible offenses. At least Dowdle's probably not in a timeshare, but it's rough. I think the touch floor might be higher for Dowdle this week. I don't like either option. Folks, I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. We got the starts. We got the sits. Let's get those 5 Underdog fantasy picks, and let's get you out of here on this Friday morning. Russell Wilson, higher, 225.5 passing yards. He's had at least 264 passing yards 2 of the past 3 games. Baltimore has allowed 8 of 10 passers to top this number of 225.5 against them this year. One of the misses was 223. So basically, 9 of 10 quarterbacks had at least 220 yards against them. I think Russ has 225.5. Higher. Correlated with George Pickens, higher than 69.5 receiving yards. Baltimore is by far the best matchup for outside receivers this year, like an alpha like George Pickens. Pickens is the Fantasy Pros consensus wide receiver 6 this week. People know he's going to blow up. He has at least 74 yards in every Russell Wilson start this year. It's the perfect matchup. We're taking him higher. And then we got one more higher before we get 2 lowers. We're going to go Nick Chubb higher than 14.5 rushing attempts. He's been higher than that in the past 2 games before the bye. One of those games was even a loss. I think they're just going to feed him after the bye week in a great matchup. And if he was already going over that in 2 games before the bye, I think he could very well get close to 20 carries in this game against the Saints. And then we're going to go Tony Pollard, lower, 53.5 rushing yards. The tough matchup. They're heavy underdogs against the Vikings. He outcarried Spears 9-7 last week. I just don't know if the volume will be there. I don't know what the role is going to be like. So we're just going to lean lower in a really bad matchup. And then last one, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, lower, 52.5 receiving yards. I mentioned it before. The 7 games he's played without Metcalf, he hit 50. He was above 53 yards once. He's just really been struggling this year, especially in these tough matchups. And, tough matchup this week against the 49ers. Jaxon Smith-Njigba, lower receiving yards. Pollard, lower rushing yards. Chubb, higher rush attempts. And then Russell Wilson and George Pickens, higher on their yardage totals. Pick 2, Maye, Richardson, Russell Wilson. We're going to start Wilson in Maye. I think I'd sit Richardson against the Jets this week. Is it crazy to start Estime over Pollard? I don't think it's crazy. I don't have a strong take there. Thank you, P-Money, for those questions in the chat. We snuck them in. Folks, I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. We hit you with 17 fantasy starts and sits. We hit you with 5 underdog fantasy picks. We hit you with another how about them Cowboys. Thank you, everyone. Good luck in week 11.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.